joining us. We are really excited about today's webinar. We had a significant number of attendees. We had over 200 people register. So we know there's a lot of interest. And I'm just going to give folks a few minutes to go ahead and continue to dial in. It's going to be a great discussion, and I really want to thank our panelists for taking time to join us here today. Let me go ahead and advance to the next slide. Okay, so hopefully you can see on the screen right now an agenda. And what we're going to do today is I'll provide an overview about the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. I'll introduce our panelists. We will talk about a new paper called Microgrid Momentum. We will hear about the government perspective on financing microgrids and the private sector perspective. And then we'll have an interactive discussion. So before we get started, I did want to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and webinar attendees are muted. You can submit your questions online in that chat box, and I'll raise them for our panelists. So if you have clarifying questions, I can raise them at the end of each presentation. And if you have discussion questions, we'll take that at the end. And with that, I just want to say a few words about the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We are an independent, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization. We were founded as the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. And as you can see on your slide here, our core mission is to find practical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, deploy clean energy, and strengthen resilience to climate impacts. What we do is we bring cities, states, and national policymakers together with businesses and other stakeholders. And we conduct research and analysis. We have a lot of publications, and they're all available for free on our website. So I encourage you to check those out. We also have a Business Environmental Leadership Council, and it's made up of about 30 or so Fortune 100 companies. And as you can see on the slide here, they really represent the multi-sector nature of our economy. So we have companies from the financial sector, we have utilities, we have auto companies, we have oil and gas companies. And we like to meet with these leadership companies and talk about climate policy. We also have a project called the Solutions Forum, and this conversation today is part of a long-running effort to bring together business leaders and states and city officials to find pragmatic solutions to our climate challenges. We started the Solutions Forum with a series of public discussions in DC on market-based strategies, on energy efficiency, and on clean energy finance. And recently we had a series of invitation-only workshops across the country, and we've had some webinars to explore key issues in depth. And we're very happy to be bringing this webinar to you today. So we definitely want to thank our sponsors for the Solutions Forum, and these include Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Energy Foundation, and the JPB Foundation. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our speakers. The bios are available on our website, so I'm just going to give a brief introduction. Our first speaker is going to be Doug Vine. He's my colleague here at C2ES. He previously worked at Meridian Energy, which is New Zealand's largest electricity generator. He holds an MBA from Victoria University of Wellington, as well as a Master of Science in Systems Engineering from Virginia Tech, and a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Maryland. Then, providing the government perspective, we have Kyle Haas. He is an Energy Policy and Compliance Analyst at the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment, and he works closely with policymakers, ratepayers, businesses, and utilities to achieve DC's energy system goals. Also with us is Dr. Shalom, and he is a microgrid architect at Urban Ingenuity. He actually became the nation's first microgrid architect more than a dozen years ago when he served as Pareto Energy's Chief Technology Officer. Dr. Flank received his Ph.D. from MIT and his BA in physics from Cornell University. So with that, hopefully a lot of folks have dialed in, and I will hand it over to my colleague Doug to talk about a recent paper, Microgrid Momentum.
Thanks, Fatima. So yes, the title of the paper that we worked on last year, we collaborated with two professors at George Washington University. The title of the paper is Microgrid Momentum, Building Efficient, Resilient Power, and a link to the paper is there on this slide. It's also included in the invitation to this webinar. My co-authors on the paper were Donna Atanasio, a GW Senior Advisor for Energy Law Programs, and Dio Shitu, Assistant Engineering Professor. The paper was posted on the website on March 8th. On the same day, we also held a microgrid event at GW and with GW. We had two panels discussing a range of microgrid issues, including finance, resilience, environmental benefits, cybersecurity, legal, and regulatory issues. And along with the two gentlemen that you'll be hearing from next, Shalom and Kyle Haas, we also had representatives from AECOM, DNVGL, Duke Energy, NRG Energy, and Schneider Electric. And you can also watch the video of that 2-hour event at the same link that you can access the paper from. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the paper, highlight some of the benefits of microgrids, and the key takeaways from that paper. Next slide. The paper, which was developed with funding from Duke Energy Renewables, set out to investigate the basic research question, what are the barriers to microgrid deployment? The focus was on financing challenges, but wrapped up in those issues are the existing legal framework and issues around the existing legal framework. Additionally, because we had access to a GW engineering resource, we developed our own basic linear optimization model and explored some basic trade-offs between emissions and costs for microgrid development. We did not address technical issues in the paper, things like moving away from proprietary technical offerings and working toward developing open standards and options for interoperability that would help increase deployments of microgrids as well. That would have just been a bit too much to take on. Next slide, please. So why is C2ES interested in microgrids? Power sector emissions, you may be aware, have been falling for the past 10 years, and we continue to look for strategies to build on that momentum. Scientists tell us that we're going to need to make even deeper reductions in emissions in the coming decades in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. We also know that climate change is here and now. We are already seeing the effects of climate in sea level rise, more frequent downpour events, and intense storms. So C2ES is interested in both the mitigation and adaptation attributes of microgrids and other forms of distributed generation. Microgrids can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in at least two ways. First, they offer the opportunity to deploy more zero-emission electricity sources within the microgrid. For example, a microgrid can balance generation from intermittent renewable power sources with its dispatchable natural gas-fired generation. They can also use energy storage to balance production and usage within the microgrid. The amount of renewables that can be deployed in a particular microgrid is highly dependent on the setting of the microgrid, whether it's in an urban, suburban, or rural setting. The particular geography and the climate of the microgrid is going to factor into how much renewable energy you could potentially incorporate. The second way microgrids reduce GHGs is by making use of energy that would otherwise be lost. Since microgrid electricity is generated adjacent to where it will be used, line losses are minimized and less power is required to meet an equivalent level of demand. Additionally, when electricity is generated from certain centralized power sources, fossil fuels and nuclear power, for example, a great deal of heat energy is created and typically released directly to the atmosphere unused. But when power is generated close to the end user, it becomes economically feasible to use this heat energy productively, such as heating water or heating space in nearby homes and businesses. Therefore, less fuel is needed and is combusted, resulting in lower greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to these benefits, microgrids can enhance grid resilience to more extreme weather. When Hurricane Sandy cut off power to millions of homes and businesses in the Northeast a few years ago, mostly parts of universities were able to keep the lights on using their own power generation systems, their microgrids. And this ability to sustain electricity service during widespread natural disasters is one reason for the growing interest in microgrids. They can also help the macrogrid or the larger grid recover from a system outage, either indirectly by sustaining services needed by restoration crews or directly by helping to re-energize the macrogrid. Another example that we like to cite is the Food and Drug Administration Federal Research Center microgrid in White Oak, Maryland, which has inherent resilience and reliability value for the FDA. This was brought up at our event. There's a tangible monetary loss if scientific experiments are ruined due to the loss of power and climate control. So while surrounding areas in Maryland went dark during a 2011 earthquake, during a 2012 derecho event, Hurricanes Irene and Sandy, and numerous other storms, the FDA's center microgrid remained online. Additionally, that project prevents about 72,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year, and it also helps support the macrogrid by providing ancillary services, which is a source of revenue for that microgrid. For utilities, microgrids can ensure power reliability in remote areas, so utilities are also interested in microgrids. For example, in Borrego Springs, California, a mixed ownership microgrid is currently providing clean, reliable, and resilient power cost-effectively to a hard-to-serve isolated community. Next slide. So these are some of the key takeaways from the C2ES GW paper. Microgrids currently provide a tiny fraction of U.S. electricity, but their capacity is expected to more than double in the next 3 years. Fueling interest in microgrids is their ability to improve resilience and reliability, increase efficiency, better manage electricity supply and demand, and reduce gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Each microgrid's unique combination of power source, however, customer geography, and market can make financing these projects a real challenge. So financial feasibility studies, simulation modeling, and public-private partnerships all could play a growing role in overcoming these financial hurdles. States have a role to play in facilitating microgrid development. Most existing microgrid projects are concentrated in 7 states: Alaska, California, Georgia, Maryland, New York, Oklahoma, and Texas. Some states, including California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, have created funding opportunities for microgrids. But most states lack even a legal definition of microgrid, and regulatory and legal challenges can differ between and within states. So states can assist project developers by providing funding, grants, or low-cost loans to perform feasibility studies or to aid in demonstration and commercialization. Clearly, we need to do more work on the legal front, to work on definitions for microgrids, which clearly set forth the rights and obligations of the microgrid owner with respect to its customers and the macrogrid operator. These issues include rules and costs for connecting to the macrogrid and microgrid developers' access to reasonably priced backup power, also known as standby service. Also, access to wholesale power markets to sell excess electricity or other services. Also, franchise rights granted to utilities may limit microgrid developers' access to customers. Microgrids may face challenges in competitive retail access states if they're perceived as locking in customers. So addressing these barriers is essential to the wider deployment of microgrids. Also, we looked a bit at linear programming models and found that they can help microgrid project developers. or energy managers tailor their proposed projects to focus on cost savings, emission reductions, or any other factors that they want to focus on, including operating independently from the microgrid. They can help forecast or estimate cash flows and financing needs, manage power supply and demand, and the models can continue to be used throughout the life cycle of a microgrid during the development process and during the operational phases of the microgrid. And finally, to develop supportive frameworks and policies, it'll be vital to promote greater dialogue among the finance community, service providers and implementers, government officials at all levels, regulatory agencies, and other stakeholders. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Fatima.
Thank you very much, Doug. That was great. And again, that paper is available on our website, as well as the recording of that event. And now I'd like to hand it over to Kyle to give us the government perspective on financing microgrids.
Hi, thanks, Fatima. And I want to make sure that I thank C2ES for inviting me to this. I'm always happy to talk about fun concepts like this. So let's dive in. Microgrids are important to different governments for different reasons, but a common driver is the responsibility of a government is to ensure critical services are available when they're needed most. So the government doesn't necessarily need to provide all of these services. For example, if there was an event and you were able to go to a CVS and get whatever you needed there, whether it be medically related or just food and water. And in some instances, it is services that they provide, and that's police or security or water. So if you're a government or if you're working with a government in terms of developing a microgrid, think about what services are most important in a scenario in which you're trying to prepare for. So for the federal government, that's often security and recovery, and it applies to the military, the National Guard, a number of recovery services and institutions that they facilitate. On a state and local level, it's much more traditional critical services. So how do we make sure that the water pumps that run through your network continue to provide fresh water to users? And as we get deeper into a digital world, especially considering some of the recent outages that happened in San Francisco and New York, we really understand how reliant we are on energy and the systems that are tied to energy, including just something as simple as traffic lights, right? How do you make sure that the trucks can continue to deliver all of the products and goods to your city if your traffic lights are down, right? It's issues we don't always think about, but I think it's very important to consider what services are you responsible for, and if something unfortunate were to happen, how do you make sure that you provide those services? So let's go to the next slide. So this is my personal microgrid experience. It started with a really great team at the Maryland Energy Administration. A few years ago, we were directed by the Governor, Martin O'Malley, to take a look at resilience and microgrids. And this really sort of started our formal journey into this investigation, and people had been working on the concept of microgrids for a long time, but this was really where we first started diving into what are these barriers and how can we help facilitate them. The nice thing about the state of Maryland is that it seems like the industry has responded, whether it be smaller developers building resilient micro or pico or nano grids, whichever term you prefer. Maryland has really embraced energy resilience as a priority. And the drivers for the state of Maryland were not just resilience for resilience sake, but also how do we identify public purposes that we can allow microgrids to facilitate. There are a number of projects that are now going on in Montgomery County, as well as a number of other surrounding counties driving this resilience initiative. So my next experience was at the Army Office of Energy Initiatives. Obviously, the priority for the Army is continuity of operations. How do you make sure that the fort or the Air Force base that is serving your area and needs to be called on, how do you make sure that no matter what, those resources are there? Again, as geopolitics become more complicated and As energy and sort of computers in the digital economy become more foundational, those risks grow. And the Army is very attuned to that. And if you're interested in the military initiatives, I would recommend taking a look at the Army Office of Energy Initiatives website. They actually have a lot of really great information about the projects that they're developing, but not only are they developing microgrids, they're also developing microgrid-ready facilities. So where the technology or the economics didn't pan out as the project was being developed, they made sure that they deployed solar or combined heat and power or biomass technologies in a way that when the technology, when the cost effectiveness for that particular installation made sense, that they were then able to plug in the right controllers and distribution network technology to make sure that that system could island. Or how could you plug in storage? And as we're developing projects, even outside of the Army, we should be considering how we can future-proof our projects. How can you make sure that the solar project or whatever technology project you've decided, when you're ready and you're ready to make that investment, and hopefully you'll be saving some money from investing whatever distributed resource you've invested in, how can you leverage those funds to enhance those technologies and make sure that your system can be resilient? Currently at the District of Columbia, clean energy integration is a priority, and making sure that you have dispatchable power that is going to help to facilitate the integration of more perhaps intermittent renewables is a key priority. Another challenge that the district faces is that not only are seas rising, but the District of Columbia is actually sinking. And that has a little bit of nuance to it in that as the ice shelf recedes from the last ice age, mini ice age, the plate that the District of Columbia sits on is actually getting lowered back into the waters that surround it, the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. So this is an important challenge for the district, and that's their priority there as well. Also, looking for non-wires alternatives, right? How do we integrate this into our system planning so that we can be sure that a dispatchable resource can provide adequate service when called upon? So there's a couple deliverables that DOEE and the district has put together, one of which is a microgrid extension service, which we're working with a really great team who you might hear someone from on this particular call. But there's a lot of excitement around this area, and each level of government, whether it be city at the District of Columbia and district, all the way up to the federal government and states, everybody has a different priority. Everybody has different drivers, and understanding why you're interested in microgrid is perhaps the most important thing in developing a project. So next slide. So this is a product of Green Tech Media, and here you can see not only what areas are developing the most microgrids, and as you can see, the Northeast is the biggest, has the most deployment of these technologies, whereas the drivers for Northeast governments and private entities are exactly what the team beforehand at C2ES had spoken about. Between the derecho, which was a weird weather phenomena we had a few years back, hurricanes, that's the real driver, or at least the genesis of a lot of those discussions, whereas in areas like the West Coast, San Francisco, they're looking to develop projects that are not reliant on natural gas, because one of their key fears or one of their key concerns are massive earthquakes. So if your natural gas distribution network is disrupted during an earthquake, having a CHP microgrid might not be the best option if you're reliant on that distribution infrastructure. So every region has their own priorities. Every region has their own business models that are emerging. But as you can see, some states are building lots of natural gas microgrids. Some are building lots more renewables. But the drivers, the key reason why you're considering a microgrid is often the variable that these states are considering. So I would definitely recommend taking a look at Green Tech Media's resources on this. There's a number of other great organizations out there investigating them, and plenty of data to dig through. So let's go to the next slide. So when I think about a microgrid and I think about financing a microgrid, I think about what the value stack that system can offer. So resilience is always a priority. Inherently, being able to island gives you resilience, and that's a lot of the premium cost that you'll pay in having a system that can island from the rest of the grid or your larger system. But that's not, in many instances, going to pay for a project in and of itself. So what we need to do is think, is resilience really worth it for us? Are we willing to pay this premium for making sure that our Food and Drug Administration experiments are able to survive through any sort of outage? What have outages cost us in the past, and what do we expect them to cost us in the future? Understanding what that value is will help you to convey the importance of a system and help you justify the installation. But then how do we get the next level? How do we make sure that we are squeezing every ounce of value out of these resilient systems that we can? Well, the first place that I would recommend you to look if you're in a market like PJM, like we are here, how can we look to PJM to identify price signals and markets that we can leverage? Some of those might be participating in ancillary service markets. Some of that might be participating in capacity markets. And understanding how those wholesale markets work and how your system can leverage them and provide a larger system benefit. Those are the types of questions that, from a government perspective, we're trying to ask and trying to understand how can we, A, direct these types of projects towards value streams that make sense, and B, how does that benefit us from a system standpoint? So stepping to the next one is from a local benefit. So the first two bullets are values that exist today. In many markets, the local benefits are not currently sufficiently valued. So on one level in New York and a number of other states, they're developing grants and incentives, perhaps not always for microgrids specifically, but if your state has a grant or incentive for battery storage or for combined heat and power, how can you leverage those in the context of a microgrid project to add more value? The last piece is the next frontier. How do we develop distribution level system benefits and price signals? So if these systems can help us defer a substation or ensure that power quality on a local level is facilitated, we don't quite yet have a method for compensating those services on a local level in many states. I think New York is beginning to explore that, as well as a number of other states. But just taking a look at that actually takes me to my next slide. How about we go to the next slide? There we go. So here's an example where the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program has developed at least one, probably multiple, resilient projects that are offsetting the need for a substation. So I would encourage you to take a look at the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program, microgrids associated with it. But one of the big questions is, how do we ensure that these resources are available when we need them? And again, right now on a wholesale level, many states and regions have some of those signals and have some of those requirements for performance in order to be compensated. But to wrap up my few comments, I'd like to say, how can we turn markets against these high microgrid costs, relatively high costs? And my argument would be that distribution level markets and signals from the utility, from the governments, whether they be grants or whether they be more sort of natural market technologies, how can we really take the innovation that this industry has and point that market at the challenge of resilience and at the challenge of sustainability? So I think that's my last slide.
Okay, thank you very much, Kyle. That was very helpful. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Shalom to talk about the private sector perspective.
Great, thank you, Fatima, and thank you also to C2ES for setting up this webinar. It's great to have so many people attending and interested in these topics. It's also great to follow my colleagues, Doug and Kyle, with their great presentations. And thank you, Kyle, for the Microgrid Extension Services call out. as well as for DOEE's support. I wanted to step back for a second and look at the broader context, because microgrids are not achieving the prominence they are in isolation. When we first started building power systems back in the 19th century, essentially everything was a microgrid. Each individual generating station was its own island, responsible for its own loads. The evolution that we saw throughout the 20th century to larger and larger central plants and more interconnection into the transmission grid that we've come to know, I kind of got away from the advantages of local resources, but what we're seeing today is really the best of both worlds, where you remain connected to the larger grid in the vast majority of microgrids, Northern Alaska accepted, but you also get the advantage of the local resources, and moving into that new world in the next slide, you really I see the reason for the rapid adoption of distributed resources of all kinds, not just including microgrids, but microgrids are certainly a prominent part. Now, I don't think microgrids are a universal solution. My rough guess is that around 10 or maybe 20% of energy resources could be ultimately provided efficiently with a microgrid strategy. That's still pretty substantial. In the US context, that's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of future investment. It's not universal, but it is, I think, going to be a rising tide. As you see on the next slide, you can draw an analogy with what's happened with green buildings and LEED certification in particular. That in the early days, this was something that you had to be a real pioneer to adopt, and the return on investment wasn't completely clear. You really just did it because you believed in it. But a relatively few years after its debut, what we're seeing now is that in certain markets, if you're not LEED certified, you're not competing. It's a given that a green building strategy is necessary in order to play in the commercial real estate market. And although, again, not a universal solution, I think that microgrids will see a similar kind of assumption of a prominent role in a lot of different settings. Now, you saw Kyle talk about the value stack, and people discuss this in the microgrid context all the time. In the next slide, I would push back on that just a little bit, even though I use the concept as well, to say any successful business often relies on a value stack when you're dealing with larger complex systems. So here's a real estate example. Sure, the bulk of your revenues might come from sale of units or from tenant lease revenues. That's the foundation. But you're not going to be successful in the real estate business unless you've learned how to optimize a lot of other factors to increase your returns, increase your revenues, lower your costs, lower your financing costs. It's a competitive world out there, so people learn how to optimize and gradually improve their business by looking across a lot of different dimensions. So it's really not any different with microgrids, although the individual elements are obviously specific to microgrids. So on the next slide, you see at least one rendition of what some of those elements might be, as many as we can fit onto a single slide. And the real point here, and I'll go through some of the details, is that especially if you're looking at private sector finance, the best way to finance a microgrid is to make sure that it pays for itself. So we have to look at all of the different elements of where those revenues can come from, where the cost savings are, so that the microgrid is self-supporting, self-sustaining. So this version of the value stack has the three main columns. The one on the left is the most traditional, energy revenues. You're selling energy for heating, cooling, electricity. Now factored into that is that you might also be selling, for example, renewable energy credits, or taking advantage of other sustainability incentives. We'll talk about PACE financing. Because of the higher efficiency, lower emissions, you may have access to grants or lower cost capital. But nonetheless, the foundation is that you're providing energy services and being paid for those services. Now, there's also a whole set of new revenue streams that aren't quite as traditional. Some of them relate particularly to new construction, and we'll look at a case study here for how a microgrid approach can reduce the cost of the new buildings in a development or create new design opportunities. There's also a whole set of revenue streams associated with the interaction with the macrogrid. We are still connected to the macrogrid, can provide valuable services back to the grid. One of those Kyle was just discussing with the distribution system impacts. And another very prominent is what's the value of enhanced reliability or improved power quality. There's a microgrid under development in the Northeast, particularly for manufacturing, because the power quality they get from the grid isn't good enough. So the combination of self-generation but also power electronics to improve the quality of the signal that they get is the key market driver in that particular case. And then the rightmost column, little softer kinds of benefits, harder to monetize directly, but for people with the right position in the right industries, these can be real drivers. So being able to market a new, perhaps higher-end, transit-oriented development, being able to identify sustainable power, more reliable power as a community amenity, both for sales purposes but also for things like zoning approvals. The LEED system recognizes the sustainability benefits from microgrids and district energy more generally. So microgrids can help you move from silver to gold, from gold to platinum. There's a new standard from the U.S. Green Building Council called PEER, dealing with reliable power systems. That may become just as much of a selling point. And from a community planning perspective, increasing the resiliency of neighborhoods, making them more attractive places to work, live, and play is, again, a little harder to put a concrete value on in terms of numbers, but people who are used to, for example, selling real estate, know how to make that part of the package. But getting back to basics on the next slide, this is the foundation. Energy sales, the value of the heating, cooling, electricity compared to the red line below that, which is the cost of generating that energy. That's essentially your gross margin. That again is the foundation of a good microgrid. If you are not earning blue sky revenues with your microgrid, then you're probably not going to be able to appeal to the private sector from a financial perspective. There are techniques, once you've got those revenues, for how to be more efficient on the capital investment side. An example on the next slide is PACE financing, Property Assessed Clean Energy. In the District of Columbia, commercial PACE is now well established and actually administered by my company, Urban Ingenuity. It has a number of benefits, not just a lower interest rate, but also being available for sites that otherwise wouldn't have a credit rating that would be finance worthy. Being able to offer off-balance sheet financing, and we can go into some more details on this in the discussion if people are interested, because it's still a relatively new instrument in microgrids in particular. So in addition to being more efficient with how you deploy your capital, you also may need less capital to begin with if you can reduce other costs in a project. So here's a brief case study that uses a particular building built in Washington, D.C. As you can see from the picture, we have carefully anonymized this case because there are no palm trees in front of buildings in Washington, D.C. Nonetheless, it's a fairly typical downtown building, decent size, recently constructed, LEED Gold, etc. And we were able to work with the builder to identify the very specific costs that would have been avoided had they used a microgrid in that development. So the next slide shows that you don't need to install your own boilers and chillers if there's hot water, chilled water loop as part of a district energy system. You can get rid of those cooling towers and the whole water treatment system that goes with that. You don't need your own standalone diesel generators if you've got the reliability of the larger microgrid. And you don't need to worry about the process and expense of installing all of those things that you now no longer need. You can also convert a certain amount of space that otherwise would have gone toward that equipment. Now it can go toward revenue generation as leasable space. So the conclusion of that case study on the next slide is some fairly substantial numbers. They add up to about $5 a square foot on capital cost reductions. Now that's only a relatively small percentage of the total cost of building the building. But in terms of the offset to the total cost of the microgrid, that's a very significant chunk that can change your perspective on the rate of return for the microgrid from a kind of middling, not particularly attractive return to, once you recognize these offsets, being a very attractive high rate of return that you'd basically be crazy not to go after. So we've had revenue generation from energy sales. We've had ways of being more efficient in deploying capital. Here we have capital offsets. You can also create new kinds of value, as shown on the next slide, by what you do with the microgrid capabilities. So here's one example, is that you really can take full advantage of rooftop space that in the old days would have been devoted to mechanical equipment, cooling towers, etc. So instead you have options for solar panels, for green roofs. If you're good, as the picture shows, you can even do both at once. You also have opportunities to use low-grade thermal. Before the hot water goes back to the central plant, the temperature has already dropped, but it's still warm enough to do things like heat up an open atrium or a nice rooftop pool that now can stay open for 10 months of the year, let's say, with heated water for essentially zero cost. Again, slightly harder to directly monetize, but developers will recognize the value. Now, one of the hardest, but nonetheless most important elements of the value stack, one of the hardest to concretely monetize, is the reliability, the continuity of service. So in the last slide, you can see the impact of that with NYU's microgrid during Superstorm Sandy. It's not actually why NYU primarily built that microgrid to begin with, but it's a big part of why they're immensely proud of it and are now replicating that strategy for other parts of NYU's properties. So with that, I will turn it back to Fatima, and I think we'll have time for questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Flank. That was very interesting to see all those case studies. So we do have a couple of specific questions, and then on the slides you can see some general questions, and we'll definitely get to those. But I do want to start with some of the audience questions that have come in. And so one question that has come in is about fire codes and whether there are any significant issues relating to approval by fire departments relating to, for example, battery storage. So I'll just open that up to any of our speakers.
Sure, I can talk real briefly to that. Obviously, especially considering, lithium-ion batteries, there are challenges in terms of safety. There are new technologies that are coming out, including flow batteries, which are a little bit safer. There's mechanical storage, there's thermal storage, but Shalom can probably refute this claim or not. I think it's really about the control and system control architecture that you have put together, and making sure that the battery is operated in a way that is safe. Clearly, there have been some instances of batteries causing significant safety problems and fire code problems. But I think that that's something that we need to address as an industry outside of the context of microgrids alone. I think that we're getting better at it. I think that the new chemistries that are coming out are safer and more interesting. And sort of as these technologies evolve, we will get better with them. And I think that 100%, nothing is 100% safe, but I think that every day we're getting safer, and that these technologies, in most instances, every project that I've ever worked on, the batteries that were deployed did not have significant safety impacts. That's not to say that they never will or that other projects don't. It's to say that you really need to think about the quality of the battery and the control system and the safety measures that you have in place, and that hopefully that will, working with your local fire departments and the experts in this field, will continue to mitigate the risk associated with that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I don't know, Shalom, if you want to add to that at all?
Sure, I would just add that the question is actually an important reminder that microgrids are really about a system integration strategy, and that the individual components of microgrids come from their manufacturers, who take responsibility for things like working with fire code enforcement officials. We saw, for example, a number of years ago, all the headaches that Capstone had to go through to get New York City's fire department to approve the siting of natural gas-based generators on rooftops in the city. It was a new approach, it was unfamiliar, it took literally years, but that was handled by the component manufacturer, by Capstone itself. And the same thing is happening with batteries or for anything else that you include in the microgrid.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. We do have a number of questions about how private energy suppliers could be partners rather than adversaries. And that, that kind of goes to that first question that you have on the slide about the right relationship between the public and private sectors. So I don't know, Kyle, do you want to start there and just kind of give us your sense on partnership with private energy suppliers and partnership between the public and private sectors?
Yeah, certainly. And I think from a government perspective, I think that the key role of government is to be an enabler of microgrids. How do we develop the regulatory structure, the policies, the market signals that help to develop not only microgrids, but the type of microgrids that will support the existing distribution system, right? This is an important thing to keep in mind, is that we have lots of money that we paid for substations and lines and reclosers and all of these assets. And those are important investments for us to leverage, especially in the United States. So I think the goal of government should be to enable these technologies and to show and prioritize where projects can have the most impact and can help to support the government's key functions, whether that be new price signals in the long run, or in the short term, providing grants and incentives to projects that make the most economic and social sense. I think that's probably the best role that utilities can play, that governments can play in the short term. And I think that the existing distribution network and those operators play a very important role in making sure that we have the right information, right? Where on the system could a microgrid or dispatchable capacity offer a benefit? And I think government should play a role in facilitating that discussion, providing the direction to third-party developers and utilities, regulated utilities alike, to make sure that the government has the vision, right? The government is supposed to represent the interests of its constituents. So providing a clear vision and the roles within that vision, and facilitating the discussion as we go through a somewhat complex transition of our energy system, that's the key role that I believe that governments should play.
Great, yeah, and Dr. Flank, if you want to add to that, feel free.
I completely agree with all that. Let me just add a slightly different perspective. When we're talking about public sector, we're often talking about public service commissions or independent system operators and so forth. Very, let's say, technocratic institutions. You may have noticed that in my value stack there was not a prominent place for sustainability. It's not because I don't think it's important, but in today's world in the private sector, it's difficult for companies to justify spending money on lowering emissions. It doesn't provide a direct return to them. So I think one of the roles for the public sector is to place a greater emphasis on sustainability, and potentially in ways that we haven't yet seen. So we're here in Washington, D.C. This weekend we're going to get a lot of visitors coming into town for the Climate Action March. What will be interesting to see in the future is if the same volume of people who are turning out onto the streets for these kinds of marches also turn out to meetings in town hall to demand that the next real estate development or next supermarket or whatever it is that's going up in their town meet more stringent sustainability requirements, driving some of the propagation of microgrid and other low emission strategies. It's hard to predict, but that certainly is one possible future.
And vote. That's another key checkbox there, is not only asking for it, but making sure that you vote for representatives and government officials that reflect your values, because you know, unfortunately, up until now, the climate narrative has not dug as deeply as I think as it deserves. So I will echo excuse me, I will echo Shalom's comments there as well.
Okay, great. So the next question on the slide is also kind of echoed by some of the questions that are coming in through the chat feature. So let me start with a broad question. Are there state initiatives that are creating opportunities for investment in microgrids? And I'll hand that to you guys, and then I'll follow up with a specific question. So Kyle, I don't know if you want to take a shot at that based on your experience in Maryland?
Sure. You know, I think there's all sorts of different ways where states are promoting these types of technologies, right? The state of Maryland just passed an energy storage bill that provides a pretty significant tax credit for the deployment of storage. You know, that can help make the difference between a microgrid that relies on both CHP and solar plus storage. I've heard Shalom speak, and I also reflect, you know, the value of a dynamic system that relies on different technologies, but that could be the difference, right? Sometimes some states are offering more incentives for natural gas. So thinking about the different pieces that states can provide an incentive for, you know, that's one way of looking at it. And there are other states like New York and Massachusetts and you know, the Northeast in general that have dedicated microgrid programs, but that's not to say that they're the only ones or even the leader. I think in the long run, what the markets are looking for, what developers are looking for, is not a token solution, but a long-term market-based solution, right? So if these microgrids and this resilient, dynamic, sort of interconnected system is the system that we all agree, or even many of us agree, that we're trying to move towards, how do you provide market signals, sustainable, long-term market signals on both the wholesale market and distribution level that will naturally make microgrids and resilient energy systems the obvious choice? So in the long run, I think that the states that are the most interesting and innovative to me are the ones who are looking for permanent solutions that are based off of market signals and real demonstrable projects, and figuring out sort of what they do well, what they don't do well, and how we achieve that optimal system that perhaps we each uniquely have a vision of in our head.
Okay, great. And kind of a follow-up question to that, if there were a city that would like to partner with a for-profit financing company to build new microgrids, how can they do that if the state they're in hasn't either defined microgrids or provided subsidies? So, for example, is there a way for a city to go ahead and partner with the private sector and get out ahead of the state?
Sure. Yeah, go, Shalom. I've talked enough. All yours.
So right out of the gate, I'd say yes, of course. There's lots of opportunities. A good microgrid doesn't really need subsidies. if you look at the broader picture of all the benefits that it delivers, then it should be paying for itself, and you don't necessarily need government support in that kind of direct out-of-pocket way. Very often, the most valuable asset that a city can provide is the load. A guaranteed purchaser of the output of the microgrid for energy services, at least a nucleus of it, a foundation for a larger microgrid that may mingle both public and non-public buildings or loads. That can be the most important role that the city can play, and also kind of the first mover, willing to sign up, willing to sign the contracts, or at least the letters of intent, in order to pave the way for the private sector participants if it's a larger, more diverse microgrid.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And so we've been talking about, state policies. One question that came in is, where do you think the most potential for leverage and change is, at local or state level? So, basically, I guess, where are you seeing some opportunities for microgrids? And I think Shalom was just saying that, it doesn't need incentives. You can make the financing case independent of incentives, but, where do you guys see the opportunity on comparing these levels of government?
Yeah, just to re-mention this, I agree with Shalom. Good microgrids, probably don't need a ton of incentives, but I think the most important thing is that we remove barriers and provide clarity. From a technical standpoint, we know how to do this, right? And we can do it cost effectively. But if your region has an exclusive franchise right that prevents two adjacent buildings from building a microgrid due to an exclusive franchise or due to some sort of regulatory requirement, that can submarine a project. That can prevent an otherwise cost-effective, system-benefiting project to happen. And this speaks to the larger challenge in the energy industry, right? There is a lot of fracturing in the way that utilities and third-party independent producers are regulated and compensated. And I think that's why you're seeing development in certain regions and in other regions not so much. Many utilities are looking towards the future and looking to facilitate and play a really important role in the dispatch of these technologies, but other ones are trying to prevent projects from being developed. And I think that that's a rarity. I don't think that that's something that's common throughout the system. But I do think that it takes all levels, right? So local governments have some particularly, they really get into regulation and permitting. So, what can go into a building? What can happen there? From a state standpoint, it's developing these markets, leveraging the signals that are already there and sort of moving on. So, yeah, I think that while, this technology is becoming more and more cost effective, the places where this is becoming most attractive is where the states and cities are collaborating to provide opportunities to identify priorities from a government standpoint, right? If your city says, hey, we need to make sure that our water pumping station number 6 stays up, and oh, by the way, that's right next to this fire station, right? That's where we can help to enable and accelerate the deployment of these technologies.
Okay, great. I don't know, Shalom, if you wanted to add anything to that question?
Oh, I think Kyle covered that very well.
Okay, great. So moving on to the third bullet on the slide, and I just wanted to open up the question, do you think there's a possibility for microgrids to become part of the administration's infrastructure agenda? There's a lot of talk about infrastructure inside the Beltway these days, and I just wanted to pose that question to you all to see if you think there might be opportunities.
Well, I'll start with that one. Let's keep in mind that, as I've already mentioned, microgrids are already a part of the administration's infrastructure agenda. And what I mean by that is very intelligent people who have to deal with real challenges, like the Army, are already developing microgrids and microgrid-ready systems, right? So I won't mention specific names, but there are high-level officials within the administration who are prioritizing dispatchable, resilient, dynamic, and ultimately clean systems. That may not be the narrative that they're focusing on, but when you look towards the people who have to make the real decisions, when you look towards the people who don't focus on bluster and narrative and gaslighting, to be honest with you, they're the ones who are really deploying these systems. They're the ones who, laugh at the notion that that these systems don't provide real benefits. And I think when and if that permeates to the level of the narrative, to the level of the message that's being pushed from senior levels of the administration, when that happens, is it going to be some disaster, right? As I mentioned, we had an outage in New York and San Francisco coincidentally, same day, right? Is it going to take something like that for the narrative to change? I sure hope not. But when you think about the dollars that we're spending, and you think about what the future of the energy system needs to be if cybersecurity is a priority, it needs to be, as we develop sort of resilient computer networks and information systems, it needs to be something that's resilient, that is dynamic, that considers the threats that are in front of us. And there are two options on this front. You can either shut down and say, we're just going to go back to being Luddites and we're not going to use electricity anymore, and if we do use electricity, it's just going to be old fire plants, whatever technology you want to fire plants. That's a choice that you can put in front of the American people, but I don't think that's one that they'll accept. I think in the long run, reality will come to the face, and the question is that before or after something unfortunate happens?
Sure. Shalom, did you want to add to that?
I think I have a slightly different perspective. Historically, the federal government has not had that much of a role in our energy systems, with occasional exceptions for very large-scale transmission projects. The dollars and the regulations themselves don't come from the federal government. The regulations are state level. The dollars are typically private capital or rate-based through investor-owned utilities, or maybe through a public power entity. We did have a little blip with the Smart Grid investment grants under the Recovery Act, but that didn't really move the needle on technology adoption and rolling out Smart Grid technology that much. These things have to pay for themselves. The benefits have to be clear enough that the actors at the implementation level make those decisions for their own reasons. And I don't really see a multi-billion-dollar investment program at the federal level as being in the cards.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We certainly have a lot of specific questions in the chat box, and I do want to get to those. But before I do that, I did want to address the last bullet on the slide, which is about the use of property assessed clean energy PACE financing programs to help finance microgrids. And there, why don't we start with Shalom, and I'll go ahead and go back to that slide that you had about PACE.
Sure. PACE has mostly been used for energy efficiency investments, where there's some upfront costs and then there's a direct lowering in the energy bills. And if you can place a PACE note, 15 to 20-year term, payments every 6 months, but payments made through the same mechanism as when you pay your property taxes. And it's securitized by essentially a lien on the property. The property itself is the collateral for that PACE note. That level of security, that the payments will continue to be forthcoming, that if they don't, there is a remedy, means that the financing can be at the equivalent of an extremely low interest rate, much lower than commercial finance or bank loans. So then the threshold becomes, with that kind of a long-term, low interest rate payment plan, can the semi-annual payments be less than the savings to the property owner, whether it's efficiency investments or now, in at least some PACE programs, microgrid investments. If by participating in a microgrid or adopting a microgrid, the energy costs or other costs can be lowered by enough to justify those semi-annual payments, then you qualify under the PACE programs for that financing mechanism.
Okay, and from your perspective, do you feel that the DC commercial PACE program is attracting private capital?
There are lenders that are lining up for this kind of a program. It's very attractive to them, again, because it comes through tax payments. So they're secure in that payment stream. And it really doesn't even matter to them if it changes hands. So, how does the energy equipment convey and do the contractual arrangements survive a transfer of ownership and so forth? Now to that lender it no longer matters because it's attached to the property through the property taxes. So there really isn't any shortage of investors. The only shortage is that not all jurisdictions currently have a commercial PACE program. DC definitely does. There's a number of other states or counties or municipalities that have set up their own. Some of them have been set up and never used. Some of them are much more active, like DC's. It's still fairly early in the life of that particular mechanism and even earlier in its application to microgrids. But it looks like it's going to be very attractive and popular moving forward.
Thank you. There's also a question about PURPA, and that is the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act. And the question is how PURPA avoided energy cost can help play a role in financing microgrids for renewable energy providers. And I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm not sure if analysts are familiar with this particular issue, but just wanted to toss it out there.
There's certainly many people much more familiar with PURPA than I am, but my basic perspective is that's primarily about bulk export of power into the wholesale markets. The avoided cost is defined by those wholesale markets, like PJM, for example. The problem with that price for the energy generated by on-site renewables or by a microgrid is that it's a pretty low price because it's in the context of the bulk transmission system. A large part of the value of the energy services provided by a microgrid is the fact that it's local. That matters because of reliability. It also matters because you can deliver the power without having to rely on the whole transmission and distribution chain. So a very large part of your tariff payments are not for the generation portion, they're for the T&D portion. And the advantage of a microgrid is that you're competing against costs that are combined generation plus T&D, but your own costs are really just generation. You don't have the T&D component. If you then export into the bulk transmission system, you've lost that advantage. So at particular hours of the year of high demand, you can get an attractive price on the day-ahead or hour-ahead markets. So I'm not saying you shouldn't export if you have the available capacity in your microgrid. But the traditional PURPA kind of arrangements for every hour of the year blue sky operations, that's probably not as attractive for a microgrid.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question that takes a slightly different angle, and that is, what management or governance structure would you recommend for a new microgrid venture? So what would you recommend as the ratio of public to private and the use of shareholders or a different kind of ownership structure?
Just from my quick perspective, I'm interested in long-term development of this industry and its incorporation in the larger energy system transition. I think in the early phases, government support is going to be effective and perhaps the right application depending on on your challenge, but I think in the long run, we need to be moving more and more towards private financing, private development, private investment, because again, that if the market's set up correctly, then end users can prioritize the types of systems that they want. They can build a system that, is designed to completely offset their load and but still be connected to the grid, or perhaps one that is, maybe you don't want to connect to the grid at all if you're a new development, right? You build your own system. I think that's much more of a long-term vision, and as the developing world will have much more value in that because they don't have an existing distribution system. So I think that will develop more naturally. But again, I think that the importance of understanding the landscape and the purpose of your microgrid should ultimately define what that microgrid does, how it operates, what type of investment structure you have. And I think that the government isn't always fantastic at making those investments, and holding taxpayers or ratepayers accountable for that may not be the best strategy. But I think in the long run, we want to move towards a place where these projects are just a logical solution, right? They are one option in your choice of energy development, and on an even larger scale in commercial property development or private property development. So, I think in the long run, moving towards more towards the private financing piece is going to be really important. But especially if you're in one of these very new emerging markets, the government clearly has a role to play and can help to sort of experiment and develop these.
I completely agree with that, Kyle. But I think there is one important exception that's worth mentioning. You can have two different microgrid projects with exactly the same performance. They look like they're going to deliver just as good value. One of them can easily get private financing, and the other would have no chance of getting private financing. What's the difference? The creditworthiness of the off-takers. So if you're dealing with affordable housing or economic development in a disadvantaged neighborhood, or environmental justice driven investment at a particular site, then the private markets are not going to be able to meet that demand, and there's a very important role for government as credit support, loan guarantees, and so forth, in order for that private financing to be able to work.
Excellent point, Shalom. Couldn't agree more.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and this kind of picks up on something Kyle mentioned. And this is for all of the panelists. Do you have any lessons on investments in least developed or developing nations for microgrid financing when it comes to basic service provision? So basically the question is about microgrids in developing nations and lessons for investment and financing of those.
Shalom, you want to take a first swing at that? I can follow up.
Sure. So obviously our focus here today has been on the U.S. domestic market. That said, the international market, in particular in developing economies, is going to be far larger than anything we see here in the U.S. There's the standard pitch about in places that don't have high-functioning electric grids today, the opportunities for the same leapfrogging that we saw with cell phones in Africa, etc. I think that's largely true. And the organizational forms that are going to be needed in order to drive that kind of organic growth, village by village, town by town, creating cleaner and more reliable systems than what they have today, and then gradually interconnecting them as a network of microgrids, as opposed to the top-down centralized grid that we have in the U.S. and other developed countries. So the organizational forms that are going to support that, I don't think we have yet. But I think one important factor, and there's been some experiments with this, is for there to be some form of participation or responsibility or ownership on the part of the end users. So that you don't wind up with people just attaching wires to grab whatever power they can get, but instead recognizing that this is a communal asset that is going to spread benefits more broadly if the participation is on firm ground economically and otherwise. So I don't know if that's going to be co-ops or some other form, but I think that remains to be invented in a scalable way.
Again, I absolutely 100% agree, and I think the only thing that I'll add is there's right now America has probably some of the best thought and discussion around some of these microgrids and developing really cool microgrids as of now. But I think we have an opportunity to continue to be those leaders, or there's a scenario where we get taken over, and the reason for that is because the exact same microgrid developed in Arizona versus being developed in India, the India project is inherently more valuable. That microgrid, with the exact same system, is inherently more valuable because they have more power quality issues and reliability issues. So, yeah, we're going to hopefully build a lot of these technologies, but there's a risk that if we don't sort of have that future vision, that we lose that dominance over sort of resilient DER and microgrids in general. And I think there's a lot of monetary and sort of capital opportunities in that. And I hope that to Shalom's point, that these systems are developed in a way that provide equitable value to the communities in which they are deployed. And I think figuring out how we develop the system in a way to sort of spread those benefits and to make sure that it's not uneven development and growth, I think that's a priority. But we got to this is our opportunity to lose, and collaboration and implementation and piloting are the exact way that I think we do that.
Thank you. I think that's a great note to end today's webinar on. So I want to thank our panelists again for sharing their expertise with us. That was a really wonderful panel. We did have a lot of great questions, and feel free to reach out to us afterwards and we can help you get your questions answered. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for participating, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.